How's it, Josh? Welcome back to Football Unspoken. So, this week we're going to be talking about the Europa League. And the question I have for you to start us off with, a bit of trivia. Can you tell me when the Europa League was founded? When was the first season or first year that it was created?
So I'm gonna go 2008.
It's very, very far off. To be fair, it probably was called Europa around then, but it was officially founded in 1971. Was
But
wasn't
that's one.
it? Pretty close. You got close. Oh goodness. But yeah, so apparently it was first founded in 1971, and obviously one of the big things when we were growing up around around Europa League is the fact that the Europa League used to have the Champions League teams coming down into it. The teams who had finished in third in their groups, the top couple of third position teams would drop down into the Europa League. And for a couple of years, it was a big question about whether or not that was fair to the teams who are in Europa League. But obviously, this season, we've had Spurs and Man United, who are 16th and 17th in the Premier League, get to a final of the Europa League. So has removing the Champions League teams from the Europa League made it an unwatchable experience?
It's not unwatchable. In some ways, I prefer the Europa League and the Conference that matter in the way that once the playoff stage or the group stage is now complete, you can just see the brackets of who's going to get through to the final, and you kind of track it in that way. Where before you had the uncertainty because you had the group stages, the groups of four, but then, as you said, the team that came third in the group of either the Champions League or the Europa was going to drop in, and it kind of created a bit of chaos. I will say I miss the fact that teams would drop into the Europa because I always found it really funny if a Manchester United or Barcelona came third in their group and now they had to go play the Europa. It was funny because on the one hand, they didn't want to lose more games and get embarrassed by Olympiacos or something like that. But on the other hand, they were swearing, going, I don't want to be in this bloody Europa. It's rubbish. I just want to get out as fast as possible. But I can't afford to be even more embarrassed as I am. Because generally, if they've come third in the group, they're having a poor season. It won't just be in the Champions League. That normally cascades into the domestic leagues, etc. So they're having a poor season. The manager needs a few wins under his belt to keep the job, but he doesn't want to be dedicating player like fatigue resources towards a Europa League. So they get caught in this huge conundrum. I think it's made it actually an easier watch. I don't think it's necessarily dropped the quality, but it has made it more fair. That's what I'd end up by saying. I think it's made the competitions more fair.
So it's made the competitions more fair, but we're still in a situation where 16th and 17th position in the Premier League have made a final. I mean, is that realistically acceptable? Because I mean, there are times where Villarreal for years were fantastic in Europa. You've had a couple of like very good teams winning Europa, and now we're watching 16th and 17th in the Premier League who can't get past, we can barely get past Leicester and Southampton, get into a Europa League final. Is it a situation where that's an enjoyable watch for people who want to watch Thursday night football?
Funny enough, it's probably a good thing for the marketing of the Europa League because English teams tend to have bigger fan bases, therefore they'll get more viewers, etc. I would say that this season's results in terms of who's been finalists, etc., has been a bit of an anomaly. You won't see this in future seasons, and we haven't seen this in previous seasons where teams that have done this domestically poorly have ended up actually overachieving in Europe. Now, this Manchester United squad, this Tottenham squad shouldn't be 16th and 17th in the Premier League with their squads. If we were to fairly value their squad in terms of where they should be, they probably should be in the region of 12th, 8th is probably a stretch, but probably in that vicinity. There should be a mid-table Premier League team with the quality of their squads. So they've vastly underperformed in the Premier League. Once they've realized they're not making Europe, they've also just foregone any responsibility in the Premier League. So I do think all of this combined has made them look even worse in the Premier League than they realistically are. If one of those teams are finishing 12th in the Premier League, I think it would just be an induction or an indication that the Premier League is a much stronger league across the board than your other La Ligas and German divisions, not in the top six necessarily, but once you get out of those top six positions, it kind of just highlights the Premier League has a lot more depth in strength for the teams across the league compared to some of the others. For example, Spurs beating Frankfurt, who are third, I believe, in the German league, third or fourth in the German league, It's pretty embarrassing for Frankfurt to be third or fourth in the German league, but lose to a Spurs team, which are 16th. But it just highlights for me, A, that the Spurs team has just underperformed in the Premier League for the strength of the squad, and B, the strength of the Premier League as a league overall. So I don't think it's necessarily worse for the neutral fans. If anything, it's kind of exciting that you got these teams that uh, anyone can beat anyone in the Europa. And sorry, I've gone on a little bit long here, but in the conference, I would say it's actually ruined it a little bit because you look at the run that Chelsea and some of these other teams have had to go through to reach the final. They're playing teams you've never heard of. You can't even pronounce their name. As Kazakhstan, 12th division, rubbish, and whatever else. So I think in the conference has really suffered the fact that there's not strong Europa teams dropping down, and that the fact that the leagues are so much longer now. Overall, I think the conference has suffered, the Europa hasn't.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I know for me, I think the Europa League is one of those where I tend to agree with you around the fairness. For years I used to think, how does it make sense that a team who comes third in their group stage for Champions League can win the Europa and still get back into Champions League, even if they're having a bad season. So I do tend to agree with that in terms of making it a bit more fair, and you're having teams who hopefully you wouldn't end up in the situation where it's a Man United versus Tottenham in a European final, but it might give a couple of other teams. I mean, Bodo Glimt were 2 games away from getting into a European final, which would have been very very interesting. I think a lot of people would have really enjoyed that. So I do agree on the fairness, but there is a part of me that sits there and is like, how are we in a situation where Spurs and Man United, after the season they've had, are in a final? And do you think it would have been different if it was still the old rules where Champions League teams were dropping down?
Without a doubt, if there were Champions League, even with the current format of 32 teams in this wide group stage, then it's something along the lines of, instead of those playoff teams, maybe those 8 teams, or the bottom 8, so from 16th to 24th, were to drop into the Europa, we would definitely have a different final right now. Man U and Tottenham would have been knocked out long ago, which is kind of interesting. But a follow-up type of question that I have for you is actually around the prestige of now the Europa League. Because we got so many more teams in the, not the Premier League, so in the Champions League, it almost diminishes the value of the Champions League. It doesn't become as valuable to be a Champions League team because there's 32 of them now. There's so many. And the same can be said about the Europa. There's 32 of those as well. So you could be the 64th best team in Europe and you would still be in Europa, which is disastrous. But that said, provided you are a Champions League squad, as in you're going to be in the Champions League next year, is it more valuable to win the Europa League or to win the FA Cup as an English team? What do you think is more prestigious or worth more to them? Not financially, and you're in the Champions League already, so it's not I want to win the Europa to get into the Champions League. But would you rather, as an English team who's in the Champions League, win an FA Cup or Europa League?
There's such a history to the FA Cup around who's won it, how it's been won. I mean, you saw the reactions of Crystal Palace fans when they won the FA Cup for the first time, and it's a fantastic trophy. But I think there is a part of me that's in my heart that goes, a European trophy is still a European trophy. I think the conference is a different case. I feel like the conference, I would rather win the FA Cup than the conference. I feel like there's more prestige there, and that's mostly to do with history. But the Europa, I still think, when I think about the history of Europa, the teams that have won it, as well as just the experiences you get about getting to go to all these different clubs in Europe, I feel like I would rather win, personally, I'd rather win a Europa rather than an FA Cup.
Was really fascinating about that. Like the the evidence is kind of with you in a way that if you win an FA Cup and you're not from Europe, your reward is that you qualify for the Europa, which indicates that the Europa is a bigger, better competition than the FA Cup because the winners of the FA Cup get to go to the Europa. That said, there is some sort of, and you mentioned this already, historic value of winning an FA Cup. And I'll give it to you like this. If I ask, and I'm not asking you to actually do it, but if I asked you to try, how many of the last 5 Europa League winners do you think you could name versus how many of the last 5 FA Cup teams do you think winning FA Cup teams do you think you could name? I promise you, you could name more FA Cup team winners than you could Europa. And it's just the same. Historically, we remember the winners of the FA Cups. We remember those FA Cup teams. I still remember when Wigan beat Manchester City in the FA Cup final. I could name quite a few of those Wigan players. Watson scored the winner from a corner. I still remember that. But I couldn't remember who even scored in the Europa last season in the final type of thing. So it's just, there's a very strong prestige. I would almost value it as being in the Europa, winning the Europa right now um, is a value proposition for this season and next season. But in terms of longevity and being remembered as a player, what trophies did you hold up in your career or did you win as a manager? The FA Cup has more pull to it.
Yeah, I do tend to agree with you there. I think there's just something, and it's an English bias here. Let's be 100% honest. There's definitely an English bias when I think about this, but yeah, it's just there's something special about the FA Cup. The FA Cup just makes you have it just gives you a different feeling than the kind of Europa does. And I think it's because the FA Cup, there's no comparison. You're not sitting there. The only comparison is the Carabao Cup, and everyone knows the Carabao Cup is a lesser competition than the FA Cup. Whereas for the Europa, you've got the comparison to the Champions League, and it's a bit like, well, you've won a Europa. It's not a Champions League, is it? Kind of thing. So I think in terms of cup competitions, because there's no comparison for the FA Cup, at least locally, I think that's why there's a bit more of a feeling of, yeah, the FA Cup is a bigger deal. It's a close one, but I'm probably going for the European trophy realistically. But yeah, this has been an interesting conversation just around whether or not the Europa League has diminished as a league, whether it's become unwatchable. I think we're both in fairly decent agreement that it's not unwatchable. It's probably a bit more fair. I think we probably disagree a little bit on how enjoyable it has been this season. I've not particularly enjoyed it. I think you've enjoyed it a little bit more than I have, but that's perfectly fine, as well as the interesting conversation around FA Cup and Europa. But I would love to hear what you guys have to think. Would you guys rather have your team win a Europa, or would you rather have them win an FA Cup? Let us know in the comments below. And until next time, this has been Football Unspoken. Bye for now.